Hello, welcome back to 5WH. Today we'll be looking at a spate of anti-regime protests that are spreading across southern Syria. So without further ado, we're going to jump into the what. As you can see here, the video being shown to you is a bunch of protesters welding shut the gate to the local Ba'ath Party office in As-Suwaida in southern Syria. And this is, so far at least, the high point of a wave of protests against the regime that have spread across Druze areas, that's a Christian minority, across southern Syria. So far, the protests have gone on for about 11 days at time of recording, starting last Sunday, persisting to the most recent Sunday, and ongoing as we speak. Relatively peaceful so far. There have been some arrests, but no significant violence, which, given what we know of Syria's recent history in civil war, is somewhat interesting. And we'll also see that the response to the protests varies somewhat depending on where the protests are going on. So jumping into our where, hopefully some of you will have a bit of a grasp on Middle Eastern geography, but we'll give you a quick heads up anyway. So Syria is a country on the eastern Mediterranean coast. To the north, as you can see, there's Turkey. It's got Iraq to the east, Jordan to the south, Lebanon and Israel to the west, and then also a bit of Mediterranean coast, and you can just about see the island of Cyprus sticking in there. If you direct your eyes down to the bottom of the area marked Syria, the blue pin is As-Suwaida and the red pin is Dara, which are the epicenters of the unrest at the moment in the regime-controlled areas. So who are our main actors? Well, unsurprisingly, given that it's Syria and it's been a dictatorship for quite some time, you've got top left there, Bashar al-Assad. He's been the president for quite some time. His father took power in Syria in a coup in 1963, and he is the latest scion of that dynasty. His regime has been embroiled in civil war since the Arab Spring in 2011, which has involved ISIS, Western powers getting involved. At the moment, he's still in power, but he's being propped up pretty vigorously by the Iranian theocratic regime and also the Russians, although I'm not quite sure what Russian involvement has been like since A, they invaded Ukraine, and B, Wagner has been shredded. So Syria was one of the proving grounds for Wagner fighters prior to the Ukrainian intervention, so that's a little tie into the rest of the world news for you. Sort of backing Assad, you've got the Ba'ath Party, so that's the little, the rather jazzy looking logo there. If you have a bit of a squint, the green shape in the yellow circle is essentially a stylized map of the Middle East and North Africa. So you can see like the Arabian Peninsula and the Middle East to the right, and the sort of the main shape that looks a bit like a deformed M is basically the Arab states of North Africa. The Ba'ath Party, although founded in Syria, portrays itself as a pan-Arab movement. The colours in the flag have various representations for all Arabs, the blood of the motherland and things like that. It's the same sort of like flag colour ideology that slips into European flag design. The details are kind of irrelevant. But the Ba'ath Party has been the vice-like grip on Syrian governance since, 1963. And of course is related to the party of similar name that was rocking around in Iraq for Saddam and so forth, although they are not the same entity. So we've just got people, really. We've got loads of little pictures of people cutting about. So the sort of middle left picture, that's just an image of protesters in the area. Although one of the things that's really important here, although these protests, they're just Syrian citizens living in Dara and Al-Suwaida, there are two significant minority populations in the area that are of particular relevance. So the chaps with the rather snazzy white hats are clerics for the Druze faith, which are a nominally Christian minority sect, although actually the faith is kind of a fusion of Islam, Christianity, Judaism, and some of the sort of pre-Islamic mystic faiths. I'm not a religious scholar. It's quite complicated. But the key point is, although they're a minority in Syria, their population is clustered primarily in the south, in an area which the regime has not lost control of at any point during the 12-year civil war. And you then also got the Alawites, which are another there's some Islamic minority sect, and this sect is from which the Ba'ath Party and the Assad family stem. And the reason these minorities are important is that throughout the sort of Islamic State period in the Syrian Civil War, one of the regime's very few grasps of legitimacy has been claiming to act in defence of minorities against Sunni extremism, i.e. ISIS. So these groups have been, as far as any part of the Syrian population have been, they've been sort of, not mollycoddled, but they've been supported and protected to a greater extent than others to ensure that loyalty and to ensure their enclaves remain loyal to the state. So it is of interest, shall we say, that two minorities, well, one minority in particular, that has been loyal to the regime throughout, appears to now be suffering some dissatisfaction. And the Alawite sect, at the moment, seem to remain pretty pro-Assad, but we draw them in just to sort of see how the minority interplay in Syria is interacting with protests and how it sort of affects how the regime can deal with it. So timeline here is very succinct. Protests started Sunday, 19th of August, just under 2 weeks ago now, and this was, reports vary between high hundreds, possibly as many as 10,000 protesters in major urban areas in As-Suwaida, and this has now spread to other protests in Dara, which is the other marker on the map, and that is not a Druze majority area, and also protests in sympathy throughout Syria, including cities in the north which are not currently under regime control. So this does seem to be spreading. The most recent date to be aware of was 27th of August, just gone, and that was where a protest specifically targeted the local Ba'ath Party office in Suwaida, with them welding it, evicting the residents and welding it shut. So looking into the why and how, so we need to figure out a few things. We need to figure out what it is that's causing the protests, what it is the protesters are calling for, and sort of what that may lead to. So let's start at the top. The core reasoning behind these protests appears to be the economic conditions in Syria, and these are, without shadow of a doubt, dire. So the immediate trigger appears to have been the removal by the regime of fuel and food subsidies to the Syrian population in an attempt to sort of make their budget make something akin to sense. The problem with this is that most Syrians are living on a government wage or a pension. They're looking at a wage that is worth approximately $20 per month at black market rates, i.e. the actual real exchange rate that they can buy goods for. They're calling for a rise of this to $100, but with subsidies removed and everything else, that's unlikely to be of significant benefit. And just to give an indication of the struggle they're facing, the Syrian pound has lost 80% of its value in the past 3 months. So that would be the equivalent of, something that you bought in March or April that cost you £1 now costs £5. So that's the level of inflation they're dealing with. So unsurprisingly, $20 per month doesn't go very far when things are rising that quickly. Unfortunately, the state doesn't appear to have any means to address this. And there's also persistent issues with the state actually providing core utilities. At the moment, electricity to Suwaida is on for approximately 3 hours per day. That is obviously a massive hamper on economic activity, which has knock-on effects on how much you can pay people because they can't do anything with no electricity. And the gist of it is that really the protesters are calling for a couple of things. They're calling for electricity supply up to 20 hours per day. They're calling for return of fuel and food subsidies, and they're calling for government wages and pensions to be jacked up to, as you can see from the numbers, something that approximately reflects a rise in line with their hyperinflation. The issue, and at the moment, to be fair, they're not, although there are elements of the protesters calling for disposal of the Assad regime, which is interesting given this area's staunch support for the regime over the civil war, we're not looking at that being the universal call yet. Basically, the protesters want government to intervene and do its job. The issue, looking at from an outsider's perspective, is I don't really see what scope the Syrian government has to deliver this like order of magnitude step change in delivery, and this is where the wider factors come in. So I think it's not even an elephant in the room. It's a mammoth in a shoebox. Like, Syria has been involved in a civil war since 2011. The bottom line up front of this is between 300,000 and 600,000 civilians have been killed during this conflict between the regime, the Free Syrian Army, various other militias, ISIS, the Russians, Western airstrikes, etc., 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 etc. And of the population of approximately 23 million, somewhere around 12 million of those people are internally displaced persons. So, whereas I'm not going to say they're not economically active and aren't working, it's inevitable that if you're not working where you live in a functional setup, you're going to be significantly less economically helpful than someone who's settled and their life is in order. Like, that sort of goes without saying from like lived experience. But imagine a situation where half of the people in the country are not at home, do not have a home, are displaced, are away from the place of work. Like, those sort of local economies and local networks that foster economic success have been completely eradicated in Syria. And then you've got the sort of non-human physical toll. Again, pick ISIS an example. Like, a key part of like ISIS warfare was pretty indiscriminate destruction of things that were in their way to create terror. The Russians and the Assad regime in reconquering areas were, shall we say, blasé with their use of force. So things like water refinement centres, power plants, fuel storage were targeted, not necessarily for military effect, but intentionally to strike terror and destruction amongst the civilian population to break rebel areas resolved to resist. So that's broken. And the cost of repairing that, again, would be almost insurmountable for a functioning country, let alone one that's had a civil war for 12 years and is cut off from like the international economy. And we also have issues here that Syrian instability provides some benefits to some of its neighbours. So Iran in particular has extensive proxy forces operating in Syria, primarily against Israel and also the encroachment of the West, Brits, Americans, whatever. And that chaos provides them a grey space in which to operate. A functioning Syrian state would probably not look so kindly on the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps cutting about doing their own thing in quite the same way as they can under the cover of this ongoing disturbance. We also see that the instability in Syria has been leveraged by Russia to try and gain access to the Mediterranean. They have a naval and air base on the Mediterranean coast of the country, although again it's looking a bit less manned since they've gone into Ukraine. So yeah, ongoing chaos in Syria does benefit certain other state actors that are perhaps unhappy with sort of Western-leaning global status quo, and it's and then these countries as well do not have the financial power potentially to conduct a reconstruction effort that would be necessary. So there's an element of like they want it to be slightly chaotic because it suits their needs, and even if they wanted to help rebuild Syria, I mean, the Russian economy is down the pan and Iran is also sanctioned up to the eyeballs. So there's a limited amount of aid that could be given. And then we come on to what the regime blames for all of this, which is Western sanctions. And I can't deny that Western sanctions almost certainly are having a part in the population. Being cut off from the global economic network is not good for you. That's the point. But on the flip side, I've seen no reporting suggesting that the regime has attempted to negotiate in any way to get itself lifted off the sanctions regime. Now obviously, Western government's not particularly fond of Assad. He did, use chemical weapons on his own people and has been a genocidal maniac for the last 12 years. But ultimately, the Syrian Civil War it's not a done deal, but it's definitely not as hot as it was. And there probably is scope for pragmatic discussions about Syria's future. But again, it suits the Assad regime to blame the West, and almost as soon as you start fixing the problem, you then haven't got anything. Like if you got some sanctions lifted and maybe a few Western banks were allowed to fund infrastructure projects or whatever, pick your poison. And Assad then hasn't got the whipping boy to be like, well, I would love to give you a pay rise, but the Westerners won't let me. So there's a lot at play here. The point of all this really is that I do not see a way for the Assad regime to meaningfully address the underlying causes of these protests. And that brings us a little bit further on to how we're going to wrap this. So we've got two main areas protesting at the moment. We've got Al-Suwaida, which has been loyal to the regime throughout the Civil War and has is an epicenter for the Druze population. And we've got Dara, which was one of the first cities to break into open rebellion in 2011 and was repressed heavily. Now, given the dynamics I mentioned earlier about the regime acting to protect minorities, there's the lack of force utilised so far definitely illustrates the regime is not following the same avenue that it did in 2011. But as we've just discussed, there's no way that I can see that the Syrian regime can undercut these problems and address them without simply repressing its citizens. So, that brings us really on to the conclusion, which is that the Syrian regime has limited means to address the root of these protests, like economically. There's just not the money. It has only finite tools of repression remaining. The Iranian regime is still pro-Assad. There may be other regional actors that will buy in, but a significant portion of their sort of more high-tech, more capable support came from Russia, particularly in terms of delivering air power. And to say the Russians are stretched at the moment would be an understatement. They can't rely on Russia's informal power so much either, because the Wagner Group is currently, on fire following Yevgeny Prigozhin's aviation accident near Moscow. And then, so really this is definitely another decision point in Syrian history, and I'm not quite sure I can see which way it's going to go. So really, I'd like to open this up to you. What do you think? Does the Syrian regime have a way out of this one? Are they going to resort to violence again? Will they find the money from somewhere? Do you reckon there's a chance they'll try and engage with the West and try and get some sanctions lifted in a sort of meaningful way? You tell me. I'd love to see what you say in the comments. If you've liked the video, please comment, like, subscribe. You can join me on both Facebook and Instagram by searching 5WH Pod. And I look forward to seeing you all again soon. Cheers, bye.